father knows war will destroy his children, yet he is forced to teach his two sons how to kill with his own hands. If an enemy killed one of your sons right in front of you and was about to hang the other, would you continue to abide by the so-called rules of war, or would you turn yourself into a demon that even the enemy army fears? Benjamin Martin chose the latter, but what truly tortured him was not how many enemies he killed, but his discovery that every step he took toward the war brought his children closer to death. (1776), South Carolina. Benjamin is a farmer and a father of 7. After his wife passed away, he poured all of his heart into this family. By day, he farms with his children. By night, he teaches them to identify the North Star, telling them that the star never moves and will always watch over the family. In his children's eyes, he is just a strict but gentle father. But to many veterans, Benjamin has another identity. During the French and Indian War, he was a terrifying officer on the battlefield. That experience left him no glory, only countless faces of the dead and the screams he couldn't shake off every night.
Well, the assembly's been convened, so I've been called to
Charlestown? We're going to Charlestown?
We are.
So, when the 13 colonies began to resist British rule, and the South Carolina Assembly prepared to vote on conscription, Benjamin did not call for war like the others. He supported independence, but he opposed rushing into war. At the Assembly, Colonel Burwell called on South Carolina to provide troops and funds for the Continental Army. Supporters argued that without picking up weapons, they would never be rid of a king 3,000 miles away. Benjamin countered by asking,
"Why should I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away?"
War does not just happen on a distant front, nor does it only fall on soldiers. It burns into farms, it burns into bedrooms, and it eventually makes children watch the hell created by adults with their own eyes. But the vote still passed.
28-12, the levy passed!
What was even harder for Benjamin to accept was his eldest son, Gabriel, deciding to join the Continental Army. Gabriel believed that freedom was not gained by praying and waiting. He accused his father of using his family as a shield and being afraid to face his own principles. Benjamin wanted to stop him, but realized his son had already grown up. Gabriel eventually put on his uniform and left home. The war dragged on for a long time. Gabriel sent letter after letter from the front line, telling his brothers and sisters that Charleston had fallen, the Continental Army had suffered heavy casualties, and his best friend had died on the battlefield. He admitted he was afraid of death, but also believed that it was an honor to fight for freedom. Benjamin listened to these letters while still guarding the farm. He thought that as long as he did not participate in the war, he could keep his children out of it, but he was wrong. One night, cannons suddenly roared in the distance. A wounded man stumbled into their home. When he turned around, they realized it was Gabriel. He had been tasked with delivering military intelligence, but was wounded during a retreat. The next morning, large numbers of wounded soldiers flocked to the area near the farm. Benjamin had his family bring out water, bandages, and food, treating both Continental and British soldiers. However, Colonel Tavington and his British cavalry soon arrived. This man wore a pristine uniform and spoke in a slow, measured tone, yet every command he gave was as cold as a blade.
Lieutenant, have a detachment take our wounded to our surgeons at Winsboro.
Yes, sir.
Fire the house and barns.
The British also found military documents on Gabriel.
Who carried this? I did, sir.
Gabriel was wearing a Continental uniform and was clearly a courier. According to the rules of war, he should not have been treated as a spy. But Tavington didn't care at all. He decided to take Gabriel away to be hanged and to have all the Continental wounded who could not move executed. Benjamin suppressed his rage and pleaded with Tavington to follow the rules. Tavington, however, taught this family the cruelest lesson of all right in front of him. As Gabriel was being dragged away, his younger brother Thomas suddenly rushed out, trying to save him. A gunshot rang out. Thomas fell before his father's eyes. The person who fired was Tavington. He looked at the young, underage boy without a hint of hesitation or remorse.
Stupid boy.
That shot did not just kill Thomas, it killed Benjamin's final retreat. He first had his daughter Margaret take his younger children to hide in the fields, then called for Nathan and Samuel and entered the woods with their rifles. The two boys did not know what their father was going to do. It wasn't until Benjamin had them hide on the hillside that he told them. The first shot targets the officer. The second targets a soldier. Samuel was responsible for reloading, and Nathan for shooting. He repeatedly reminded his two sons, aim small, miss small. The father who had just been teaching his children how to identify stars was now teaching them how to kill. Benjamin moved rapidly through the woods, constantly reloading, firing, and repositioning. When the distance closed, he charged directly into the crowd, engaging in close-quarters combat with a knife and tomahawk. The two sons saw their father's true self for the first time. He was neither a farmer nor the moderate man from the assembly, but a veteran completely reawakened by hatred. The escort was almost wiped out, and Gabriel was rescued. The only British soldier who escaped could not describe what kind of man he had encountered. He only remembered that the man seemed to be everywhere, like a ghost moving through the woods. From then on, the British began to call Benjamin the Ghost. But after returning home, this man who terrified the British had to bury his own son with his own hands. After Thomas was laid to rest, their father took them to the home of his sister-in-law, Charlotte. Nathan told his father that when he killed those British soldiers, he actually felt happy. Benjamin could only comfort him, saying it was to save his brother, and it was something he had to do. But in his heart, he knew that the thing he feared most had already happened. War had not only taken Thomas, but it had also planted the memory of killing in another child's mind. Benjamin left the younger children in Charlotte's care and prepared to take them to a safe location. Gabriel, however, insisted on returning to the Continental Army. Benjamin angrily ordered him to stay, but Gabriel said he was a soldier and could not abandon his duty. Father and son argued again.
Gabriel!
Thomas is dead. How many more have to die before you'll heed my word?
This time, Benjamin did not continue to escape. He followed Gabriel back to the army. At that time, the Continental Army had just suffered a crushing defeat. General Gates had the soldiers line up in perfect formation in an open field to engage the well-trained British regular army head-on. The result was that the defense collapsed rapidly, and Gates himself fled the battlefield on horseback, leaving countless soldiers behind. Colonel Burwell told Benjamin that Washington was regrouping in the north, and the French had promised to send a fleet and troops, but reinforcements would not arrive for at least a few months. The only thing they could do now was to drag General Cornwallis down in the south. As long as Cornwallis could not move north, the Continental Army still had a chance.
You actually trust the French to keep their word?
Absolument.
Benjamin Martin, Major Jean Villeneuve, French 7th Lightfoot. He's here to help train the militia.
Burwell appointed Benjamin as a colonel of the militia, tasking him with organizing local farmers to disrupt British supply lines through guerrilla warfare. Gabriel was also assigned to his father's command, and French Major Jean Villeneuve was responsible for training the unit. Benjamin and Gabriel recruited militiamen separately. Gabriel came to the town where Peter Howard lived. The residents in the church prayed daily for those hanged by the British, yet not a single person was willing to actually pick up a weapon. Gabriel told them that if King George could hang those people, he could just as easily hang everyone present. Anne also stood up to challenge her father, the priest, and the townspeople. They talked about freedom and independence all the time, yet when action was truly required, was all that remained only prayer and silence? Eventually, Reverend Oliver took off his clerical robes and joined the ranks, because a shepherd, besides tending to his flock, must sometimes personally drive away the wolves. Benjamin, meanwhile, recruited hunters, farmers, and men familiar with frontier warfare from taverns in the countryside.
They hanged my brother down to Awkward. Every damn one of them redcoats deserves to die.
Sign on it.
With all my ailments, I wouldn't make it through the first skirmish. No, sir. But you can have my Negro. You fight in my stead.
Occam had originally been a slave, sent by his master as a replacement for service. Many white militiamen did not want to fight side by side with him, but the Continental Army had announced that those who served for a year would receive their freedom. Occam did not argue with them. He simply picked up his rifle and took his place in the ranks. This militia had no unified uniforms and no aura of a regular army, but they knew every small path, every bridge, and every swamp. Benjamin never let them fight the British head-on. They ambushed patrols, attacked supply wagons, and burned down ferries and bridges. Disappearing into the woods as soon as they struck. British officers became the primary targets because a unit that loses its commander will fall into chaos, no matter how strong it is. But Benjamin also set a rule. Wounded or surrendering enemies could not be killed. During one battle, several British soldiers had already laid down their weapons, but a militiaman whose wife and children had been killed by British artillery fired anyway. Reverend Oliver accused this of being murder.
The British men of war gave no such quarter when it fired on a ship carrying my wife and daughters. I watched from 200 yards off as they were burnt alive.
Benjamin understood his pain, yet he still ordered everyone to follow discipline, because he knew all too well that once revenge loses its boundaries, there is no longer any difference between them and Tavington. The militia soon intercepted Cornwallis's private carriage, seizing not only his uniform, wine, and maps, but also his war diary and the 2 Great Danes the king had gifted him. Benjamin studied the diary carefully and found that Cornwallis was indeed an excellent commander. But this man also had a fatal flaw: pride. He looked down on the militia, believing them to be nothing more than a group of country bumpkins with farming tools. He could not accept that his bridges, ferries, and supply lines were being repeatedly destroyed by a group of farmers. And what Benjamin had to do was make his pride his undoing. As the reputation of the Ghost grew, the militia also began to recount Benjamin's past heroic deeds. Gabriel, however, noticed that whenever anyone mentioned Fort Wilderness, his father would fall silent. Under his son's questioning, Benjamin finally told the truth. Back then, the French and Indians had massacred a group of colonists. After Benjamin and his comrades caught up with the killers, they did not treat them as prisoners, but dismembered them, put the heads and body parts into baskets, and sent them back to the enemy village. That act of vengeance did indeed scare off the enemy, and it made Benjamin a hero in the eyes of others. But he never considered that glory. Those faces and those screams had followed him ever since. He was praying for forgiveness every day, and it was precisely for this reason that he was so afraid of walking back into war. Gabriel finally understood that his father wasn't a coward, but someone who had seen what hatred could turn a person into.
There will be a time for revenge. Until then, stay the course.
Not long after, 18 militiamen were captured by the British and were about to be hanged. Benjamin did not launch an all-out assault. Instead, he took Cornwallis's 2 dogs and walked into the British camp alone, carrying a white flag. He told Cornwallis that he also held 18 British officers in his hands. If the militiamen were executed, those officers would not survive either. Cornwallis looked at the distant hillside and indeed saw a row of figures dressed in British uniforms, so he had no choice but to agree to an exchange. Only after the militiamen were released did the British discover that those so-called officers were just dummies dressed in uniforms. Cornwallis had been humiliated to his face by a farmer, and Tavington had recognized Benjamin. He deliberately brought up Thomas at the farm, savoring the thrill of provoking a grieving father.
Before this war's over, I'm going to kill you.
Why wait?
Soon.
Since they couldn't catch the Ghost on the open battlefield, Tavington changed his target. With the help of a local loyalist named Wilkins, he obtained a list of the militiamen's families and began to burn houses and hunt down their wives and children according to the list. Charlotte managed to escape with the children from the farm in time, but the house was still burned to the ground.
Tavington has a list of our men. He's burning our homes, killing whomever resists.
In order to let his men settle their families, Benjamin announced a week of leave for the militia. Even if some didn't return, he wouldn't consider them deserters, because these men were husbands and fathers first, and soldiers second. During the brief break, Benjamin finally saw his children again. Gabriel also held his wedding with Anne. Benjamin took out the North Star ornament left by his late wife and personally handed it to his daughter-in-law. The North Star never moves. It tells those who are lost in the dark exactly which direction home is. But war never cares about how happy a wedding is. When the break ended, Benjamin left once again. Susan, who had been refusing to speak to her father, suddenly chased after him.
I promise, Papa, please don't
Susan,
go.
Susan. I promise. I'll come back.
Meanwhile, Tavington arrived at the town where Anne was and forced all the residents into the church.
This town has given aid to Benjamin Martin and his rebels. I wish to know his whereabouts. So, anyone who comes forward may be forgiven their treason.
One man finally cracked under the pressure and revealed the location of the Black Swamp. Tavington nodded and ordered his soldiers to lock the church doors. The townspeople finally realized that so-called mercy was always a lie. Even Wilkins felt such tactics were dishonorable, but Tavington ordered his soldiers to set fire to the church. He said that true forgiveness was a matter between those people and God. The flames quickly engulfed the entire church. Anne and all the townspeople were burned alive. When Benjamin returned to camp, Gabriel lost his mind after seeing what had happened. His father had once told him that revenge could not destroy their principles, but now, his new wife, along with the entire town, had been turned to ash. Gabriel led his men to pursue Tavington, and the two sides engaged in a fierce battle. He succeeded in wounding Tavington, but also suffered a fatal counterattack. By the time Benjamin arrived, Gabriel had already fallen to the ground. This young man, who had always believed in freedom and held to his principles more firmly than his father, was still apologizing for Thomas's death as he lay dying. Benjamin held his son and told him it wasn't his fault. But no matter what he said, he could not keep Gabriel alive. Benjamin had lost his second son. He finally understood that what he had feared most for so long had indeed happened. The sins of the past seemed to have truly returned to find him. Only the cost had not been paid by him, but by Thomas and Gabriel. He laid down his weapon and decided to leave.
Benjamin, we have a chance. Green and Dan Morgan are down from Virginia. If we win this next battle, victory in the war is within our grasp.
Benjamin countered by asking, why believe that victory would make the dead not have died in vain? He had already fought for his own reasons, and he had lost everything that could be lost. But as the troops prepared to set out, Benjamin eventually came back. Not because his hatred had suddenly vanished, nor because he believed victory could bring his sons back, but because Gabriel had once firmly believed they had a chance to build a brand new world. If their father stopped here, then the deaths of his two sons would be nothing more than death itself. In the final decisive battle, the Continental Army was at a numerical disadvantage, and the front line consisted almost entirely of militiamen. The British assumed that as long as they launched a charge, these farmers would turn and run as they had in the past. Benjamin simply took advantage of their arrogance. He had the militia hold the front line, needing them to complete only 2 volleys before retreating according to the plan, drawing the British into the main Continental force. He did not ask for a third, because facing a bayonet charge, 2 volleys were enough to potentially cost everyone their lives. Before the battle, Occam's year of service finally reached its end. From this moment on, he was free and could leave. Yet, Occam chose to stay. The man he once was had been a slave sent by his master as a replacement. The man he was now was a person who had decided to continue fighting in his own freedom. The British began their advance. Just as everyone was about to collapse, Benjamin raised his flag and walked forward, against the tide of fleeing soldiers. He shouted not to retreat, demanding that the militia regroup. Those farmers, who had once followed the Ghost to strike at the British, stopped one after another and turned back to the battlefield. The tide of the battle began to turn. In the chaos, Benjamin finally encountered Tavington. Neither of them had a way back. Tavington had the upper hand in the exchange, knocking Benjamin to the ground. He mocked this father who had lost 2 sons, believing that Benjamin was inferior to him after all.
My sons were better men.
With Tavington dead, the British line began to crumble. Cornwallis had no choice but to order a retreat, fleeing north with his remaining troops. A few months later, he was trapped in Yorktown, Virginia. Washington led his army to complete the encirclement, and the French fleet, which Benjamin and his men had waited so long for, finally arrived, sealing off any escape for the British by sea. Cornwallis had nowhere left to go and could only surrender. The war was finally nearing its end. Benjamin looked back on the journey. What he had lost was far more tangible than what he had gained. The so-called nation, freedom, and future were still unfulfilled promises. Thomas, Gabriel, Anne, and those ordinary people who had died would never come back. The only thing he could do was believe that these sacrifices would allow those who followed to live in a different world. After the militia disbanded, Benjamin prepared to return home. Burwell told him that his own wife had just given birth to a son, and they had named the child Gabriel. Jean Villeneuve also came to Benjamin's side. This French officer, who had once been hostile toward him because of the wars of the past, had now become a true comrade in arms. Benjamin returned to his burned-out farm and found that his former militiamen were busy rebuilding his house on the ruins. Gabriel had once said that after the war was won, they would build a brand new world. Perhaps this so-called new world does not start at the moment the king surrenders, but rather from the moment a group of people who have experienced loss begin to stand the first beam up again on the ruins. Because true patriotism has never been just about raising a flag. It is knowing that freedom requires a price, yet still being willing to ensure the next generation has a future where they do not have to repeat the same tragedies.